Welcome back to Bristol BookFest 2020. We are very happy to welcome our second speaker of the day, Professor John Burt from Brandeis University, where he is the Proswimmer Professor of American Literature and chair of that department. He has a long list of publications. I'll just mention one in passing. In 2013, Harvard University Press released his Lincoln's Tragic Pragmatism. We've invited him here today for really two reasons, and one of them concerns another book of his. In 1998, he edited the collected poems of Robert Penn Warren, an 800-page volume with an introduction by Harold Bloom, and really a landmark event in 20th century American letters to have a book like this. So he knows the poetry backwards and forwards, and we will be hearing more about that in a few minutes. He is also the literary executor for the estate of Robert Penn Warren. So if you want to make another movie about all the King's men, he's the guy to go to or to persuade. You may have something to say about that later. But what we asked him to do today was, we usually assume Warren is a Southern writer. He's born in Kentucky, not the Deep South, but he identifies in many ways with the Southern tradition. Yet he spent much of his adult life, maybe the greater part of his adult life, in New Haven, because he was teaching at Yale. And he seems to have been fascinated by a small group of New England writers, including Emerson, Hawthorne, Whittier, and if you make him an honorary New Englander, Melville. So we have asked him tonight, whatever it is the weather is turning out to be, we've asked him to talk about that relationship. And I'm very happy to turn the program over to him right now, Professor John Burt of Brandeis. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event. And thank you so much, Ernest, for that wonderful talk. I've heard you speak about Warren for 30 years, and you've never ceased to teach me new things every time I hear you. So thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'm going to speak about Warren and the poets of New England, but I'm going to focus on Emerson. And that's partly because his relationship with Emerson is the most fraught. Emerson admired Hawthorne deeply and learned a great deal from Hawthorne, and indeed, much of his ethos is Hawthornian. The idea of recognizing complicity is Hawthornian. His understanding of the heart of darkness is Hawthornian. So it's easy to see if you admire Hawthorne, Emerson might be a bad guy for you. Also, as a Southerner, since Emerson was very pugnaciously Yankee, it's easy to see how there might be a cultural stake in hostility to Emerson. Though I don't think that's completely true in Warren's relationship to Emerson, because Warren actually deeply admired Whittier, who was every bit the Yankee Emerson was a much more serious abolitionist than Emerson was, and a much more serious higher law idealist than Emerson was. Though he differed from Emerson chiefly in his belief that you have to recognize your moral kinship with your opponents, which I think has something to do with his Quakerism. Warren did his best to revive Whittier's reputation as a poet, as he did in his successful attempt to revive Melville's reputation as a poet. But I want to focus on Emerson because his relationship with Emerson is so fraught, and because Emerson in some way is very close to Warren himself in ways that Warren himself might not wish to acknowledge. Warren had a visceral hostility to Emerson, so much so that whenever Harold Bloom, who loved Emerson, would bring him up, he would wry up his face and say snide things on the subject of Emerson. In his own writings, there are many snarky critical remarks about Emerson, from wholesale jeering at Emerson's philosophy and thinking in his first book, John Brown, The Making of a Martyr, to a much more serious and refined criticism of Emerson's thinking in The Legacy of the Civil War, to a number of rather snarky remarks in the poem we're going to be discussing mostly today, which is his 1966 poem, Homage to Emerson on a Night Flight to New York. Now, I think that in some ways, Warren's treatment of Emerson is unfair and reflects a popularly received Emerson who is unlike the actual Emerson you read in his essays. But I don't think that Warren's criticisms of Emerson were completely off the mark. And I want to spend a few minutes before we discuss Homage to Emerson on Night Flight to New York, outlining what I think is really at stake between between Warren and Emerson, because there are things that Warren does not say explicitly when he's discussing Emerson. So I want to talk about three areas that Warren is in contention with Emerson. First, I want to talk about Emerson's theory of nature. Then I want to talk about Emerson's theory of selfhood. And then finally, I want to talk about Emerson's political idealism. So first, on the subject of Emerson's theory of nature, Emerson is commonly received as an idealizer of nature, but also as somebody who doesn't understand nature very well. He sees nature as a pleasant green blur. He has a summer vacation view of what nature is, as a place where you go for wholesome relaxation and refreshment. I think that this is not what Emerson actually gives you, although this is the Emerson you may well have learned in high school. I think the place to go to understand Emerson is to remember that Emerson's vision of nature is where you see a coincidence of the external world of cause and effect, the world of science, and the internal world of meaning and purpose and imagination and poetry. That when Emerson speaks about nature, he is looking for those moments when the outer world and the inner world, the objective world and the subjective world, come into a momentary, fragile, but tremendously important harmony. Those moments of sharp, radiant coincidence between the ought and the is. His vision of nature, I think the word for it is that it is a nature that is charged with the immanence of the divine, which is to say the presence in the here and now and in the immediately sensible of the divine aura. This vision of immanence is something that Emerson shares with Whitman, and he shares it with Jonathan Edwards, and he shares it with the poet who wrote the Book of Job. You see this vision of immanence very powerfully in God's tirade in the Book of Job, where he refers to the wonder of the stars singing together in the morning of the universe, and the wonder of the behemoth and of the Leviathan, and most of all, the potent, resistant, irreducible individuality of the animals that the Job poet speaks about. Remember the horse, who at the moment he thinks about going to battle and hears the thunder and the shouting of the captain, says, "Ha!" You see this also in Milton's description of the creation in Paradise Lost. This world in which the objects of consciousness and the self-freeing of self-consciousness in thought, that's the world of Emerson's nature. And I think that's a rather deep world, and it's a world that is not completely divorced from 19th century biology. Emerson looks at nature not just through mystics like Jonathan Edwards or Emanuel Swedenborg, but also through the best 19th century biologists of the generation before him, people like Humboldt and Agassiz. And it's important to remember that biology before Darwin was a very different art, concerned with the aesthetic wholeness of nature. Humboldt's word is cosmos, which argues that beauty and order are related to each other. Cosmos and cosmetic come from the same root. Where Warren contests this vision of nature, it's partly in a vision of what we would call a Darwinian vision of nature, but I think it's important to notice that Darwin himself did not actually entertain a completely disenchanted view of nature. The view of nature as a brute mechanism interested only in success, interested only in biological success, nature read in tooth and claw, is a vision we really associate more with Spencer than with Darwin. And it's really a vision that has to do with late 19th century British and American culture, not the world out of which Darwin himself arose. This is a world that is governed by the word I want to use for it is disenchantment, a term introduced into discourse by the great German sociologist Weber, where he argues that nature is meaningless, driven by causality, without purpose, without beauty, without value, and that all things that are of value and order may well be illusions, may well be things that we kid ourselves about. The vision of nature that Emerson outlines, the vision that we get from Humboldt and other great 19th century biologists, is a view that loses its footing after the American Civil War. And Warren sees it as something totally outmoded. But it's worth noting that Warren himself believes that that vision of nature is a nightmare. That is the vision of nature that Jack refers to in his aria or his speech about the great twitch, nature as a brute, meaningless mechanism in which all of our sufferings are mere happen so, and in which nothing we do really reflects on us morally, and nothing we do really conveys us a sense of the meaning and stake of our existence. Warren hungers for that Emersonian world, but he believes that no experience can give it to you. And I think I think that ultimately his issue with Emerson on the vision of nature is not about what Emerson wants, because I believe that Warren wants the same thing, but is about Emerson's belief that it is readily available to the human imagination. That for Warren, our access to this world where meaning and truth come together is momentary, fleeting, and frequently hidden from us by illusion, by wishful thinking, and by narcissism. It has to be hard won. And even when it is won, it's won only temporarily and only fleetingly, and never won in never won in purity and completely. It's fair to say that when Jack Burton says at the end of All the King's Men, history is blind, but man is not, that's a very Emersonian thing to say. But the difference between Emerson saying that and Warren saying that is that Emerson says that as if it's obviously true and everybody knows it's true. And Jack Burton says it only after he's gone through 8 kinds of holy hell, and only after every reader of the book has reason to doubt whether Jack Burton himself believes that. I think, like many readers, I wonder whether Jack Burton is really off the hook at the end of All the King's Men. And part of it is that the assertions he makes at the end of the novel are very glowing, but I also think not completely credible. Another area where Emerson and Warren war is on the subject of selfhood. I think sometimes we think of Emerson's concept of selfhood, in a reduced way, as if Emerson is Ayn Rand, or as if Emerson is Milton Friedman. And we mistake Emerson's vision of selfhood as if it's about the assertion of the ego, about the assertion of the me against the you, as if it represents a me-first ethos, or an ethos in which I am separated from all other persons and better than all persons, a world separated between winners and losers. And that's not actually the world Emerson imagined. When Emerson speaks about the self, he means the inner self that we barely know and always betray. Emerson's vision of the self is a vision about the still small voice. It's a vision about what we might call the real self. And if I ask you what is your real self, the first thing you have to say about it is, I'm not sure I really know what that real self is. That's something I have to continually worry about. My access to it is fleeting. Every time I believe I have that real self under control, I am probably kidding myself. As soon as I have grasped that real self, I have already begun to falsify it. Whatever the real self is, it is endlessly restless, it endlessly becomes, it endlessly self-overthrows itself, and it also endlessly falsifies itself. That's why the ethos of inwardness in Emerson is a very hard ethos, not a very difficult one. As Emerson said, not a very easy one, I meant to say. As Emerson says in Self-Reliance, if anybody thinks this rule is lax, let him try to live by it for one day. Imagine what happened to you when your mother said, I don't care what you do for a living as long as it's what you really, really want to do. That didn't solve the problem, that only made it an insoluble problem. And I think that's what Emerson's ethos of selfhood is. I think it's also important to notice that Emerson's ethos of selfhood is not egocentric. This vision of inwardness that Emerson describes is the grounds of every person's respect for everyone else. I respect you because I recognize that you too are inwardly divine, that you too have that spark, that you too are a subject, that you too are a thou whom I must not trample. A thou, in using the phrase thou, I'm quoting the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who talks about authentic relationships with people are a relationship where I don't treat you as an it, where I don't treat you as a means, but recognize, as Immanuel Kant would say, that you are an end in yourself. That is to treat you as a thou. And for Emerson, the concept of selfhood is the ground of relationships of thou-ness with other people. It is what makes possible generosity to other people. It's what makes possible the moral equality of all people. It's what underlies his democratic politics. His vision of selfhood is a profoundly democratic vision of selfhood. That's one of the ways in which Emerson differs from his chief disciple in the philosophical world, which is to say Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, there is a common criticism of this vision of Emerson's selfhood, and it is a vision, and the criticism is like that we lodged about Emerson's vision of nature, that it is insufficiently cognizant of the dark side. I think this criticism is partly unfair. Emerson is not a Pollyanna. Emerson is not Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. And he recognizes two very important limitations to the concept of selfhood. The first is he recognizes that we instantly falsify it as soon as we imagine we have it under control. And in fact, we never really are able to put away the suspicion that our lives are inauthentic, empty, failed, rags and patches. He describes in his really very famous essay, Experience, the feeling that everything I have done confronts me as a failed attempt to be me, and that everything I have done is insufficient to prove to myself that my life has been in earnest. Now, you may notice that this vision of earnest, of the sense that my life, that I have missed out on life, is all over American literature. It's the thing that Thoreau fears in Walden. It's the thing that most characterizes Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. It's the fear that's all over Hawthorne and Poe, the fear of missing out on life. It's the fear most graphically described by Henry James in his novel, The Beast in the Jungle, about a character to whom nothing ever happens. I think you'll also notice that that is also the central fear that Jack Burton has. Jack Burton is a character who has read Emerson's essay Experience and is unable to get past its lesson. The other area where I think where Emerson knows things that Warren also knows that Warren does not give Emerson credit to when he cheers at him, is Emerson in his essay Fate notices that no matter what inwardness you have, you are still subject to necessity. You are still subject to mortality. You're still subject to death. You're still subject to nature. Emerson famously argues in the essay Fate that everything we do as a self we already know is futile. But our access to meaning happens in the face of the recognition of that futility. As he famously says in the essay Fate, the purpose of fate is to teach a fatal courage. And I think you also recognize that as a very Warrenian lesson. That is one of the places Jack Burton gets to at the end of All the King's Men. It's one of the places Warren frequently gets to at the end of his poetries. This vision of resolution in the face of the dark absolute. A picture of great poems like, for instance, Evening Hawk, a very Emersonian poem, a poem where you face a very dark moment of sublimity. Now, all that said, there is a place where where Warren's critique of Emerson nevertheless is totally well earned. And that is that there's one thing that Emerson does not conceive, and that is the dark side of the human personality itself. That thing that Freud calls the death drive, or which he also calls the thanatos, the desire to return to non-being. That thing which underlies human cruelty and darkness, that thing which you don't go to Emerson to learn about, but you do go to Hawthorne to learn about, who knows all about that inner perversity that leads us to devote ourselves to our own destruction. That thing that you see in the other great talismanic author for Warren, which is to say Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness. This Emerson not only doesn't see, but his inability to see it renders him vulnerable to it. Nothing is more likely to make you demonically evil than the belief that you are a prophetic agent of good. And that is one of the things that Warren holds hard against Emerson. Now, Emerson was not stupid in rejecting these doctrines. These were doctrines that he had been brought up in. He was, after all, a minister in a late Christian tradition. He knew all about St. Paul and he knew all about St. Augustine. And he believed in rejecting St. Paul and St. Augustine, that he saw St. Paul and St. Augustine as people who represented coercion over the human spirit, the desire to keep people down under the pressure of priest and king and authority. He saw this belief in human darkness as an engine of human oppression, and he was not totally wrong about that. But that correct recognition gave him a blind spot for his own possible imbrication in darkness. And that's why Emersonian language turns up in every Warren villain there ever was, from John Brown to Jeremiah Beaumont. This brings up the third area where I think Warren differs very, very powerfully from Emerson. And this is in Warren's critique of Emerson's higher law idealism. Well, what is higher law idealism? In a nutshell, it is the belief that when law and justice conflict, you should side with justice over law. Now, it is easy to imagine circumstances under which that is the course you have to take. The people who embraced that view in the 1850s were right about slavery. They were also probably right that without their embracing that view, people would probably have looked the other way. And that in refusing to face the fact of the transcendent evil of slavery, you render yourself complicit in a bad way. Not complicit in a way that deepens your understanding, complicit in a way that puts you with the bystanders of history, the good Germans of history. Warren is very hostile to higher law idealism, and however, I think his reasons are not completely wrong either. I think I just said a few minutes ago that there is nothing more likely to turn you into an agent of evil than the belief that you have good in your back pocket. What, after all, makes you into Ahab? What makes Ahab evil but a profound reaction against evil? What moves all of Hawthorne's villains into evil but their own profound reactions against evil? What moves characters, truly dark characters in English literature, like Shakespeare's Angelo from Measure for Measure? What moves John Brown? What moves Lenin? What makes them dangerous is not that they want power. What makes them dangerous is that they want good. And because they want good, they are blind to the fact that they act like people who want only power. When, as Warren says in Brother to Dragons, our vices come to us masked as virtues. And that's one reason why we cannot defend ourselves from them, because they look like virtues when we embrace them, and they demand that we serve them in extreme ways that we do not realize break our rules, or which we think, when we embrace the breaking of rules, when we think that breaking the rules is a sign of our earnestness. Now, the danger of higher law idealism is that when you embrace higher law idealism, you cannot tell the difference between amoral law breaking and prophetic transcendence. When I make the trains run on time, is that my excuse for getting power by corrupt means? Or did I use the corrupt means because I had to make the trains run on time? I think that the power of Willie Stark is that he does understand that there is acute suffering in the world that he cannot answer except by breaking the rules. But once he has broken the rules, he is wandering in a world in which there are no more moral guideposts. Willie Stark is very glad to allow other people to think he's an amoral politician who seeks only after power. But when that thought rises in his own mind, and you can see that happen in the moment when he lets Byram White, the state auditor, off the hook, and his attorney general quits, he begins to wonder, am I really the crook everybody thinks I am? And he goes hysterical. And he invents the hospital project, which winds up killing him, as a way of proving to himself that he was one of the good guys after all. So some of the dangers of the concept of higher law idealism is you cannot tell the corrupt from the transgressively pure. You cannot tell love from rage. You cannot tell devotion to the other from the narrowest kind of egotism. You cannot tell your own vices from your own virtues, because they're all the same thing. You cannot tell love from death. So in other words, the higher law idealism puts you in a position where you cannot tell the opposites from each other, because each are so profoundly entangled with each other that you cannot do one without doing the other. This is, again, the world of Hawthorne, the world of, and especially the world of Conrad. Where you cannot tell prophetic rage from prophetic love. Now, the point of all this is to say that when Warren criticizes Emerson, he is not criticizing Emerson because Emerson is shallow or stupid or dead wrong, even though he says lots of snarky things about Emerson, but because Emerson embraces many of the same values Warren embraces, and Emerson's embraces of those values raise insoluble internal contradictions about the problem of nature, about the problem of selfhood, and about the problem of morality. So that's why I think that Warren's conflict with Emerson is a deep one, and why Warren, even though he does nothing but jeer at Emerson, when he mentions Emerson, frequently sounds so much like him. So let's look at the poem Homage to Emerson. And I think I'm going to start by sharing the screen so you can get a look at the poem. Now, the first question I want to ask is, why on earth is this poem called Homage to Emerson? Emerson appears in this poem in a few snarky asides. At 38,000 feet, Emerson is dead right. Emerson believes significance shines through everything. For the most part, Homage to Emerson on Night Flight to New York is a poem about two things. The poet is flying at night high in the air, experiencing a moment of abstraction, a moment when he steps outside of himself, a moment when his identity appears to flow away. And that's a moment which is attractive to him, but a little bit terrifying to him. And the other thing that happens in Homage to Emerson is, while in this state, the poet has a series of autobiographical reminiscences. The black man who speaks about the wart on his finger, the drunk person he sets back up on his feet in a memory of a long ago alcoholic night in New Orleans, a memory of standing on a pier in New York, and a memory of a crying face that occurs to him when he is standing on the tarmac at Kennedy Airport. It's not totally clear what any of these individual moments of reminiscence actually mean. They're all opaque, but they all have something to do with each other, and they all have something to do with that state of abstraction he's experiencing when he's flying in the plane. And the question I want to ask is, why does Emerson come up in the context of these two experiences? The experience of the night flight and the experience of these difficult autobiographical moments. Well, the first thing I want to start about the Homage to Emerson is that the experience of travel abstraction or travel dazedness is a very common one in Warren. You will probably remember it from the very first paragraph in All the King's Men, when Jack Burton imagines himself driving down highway, I forget its number, all the way to Mason City, and he imagines himself getting sort of hypnotized by the road coming at him and at him and at him, until finally he becomes one with the absolute, veers off the road, and dies in an imaginary auto crash. Warren has a similar moment of, we might call, travel abstraction in a late poem called Heading West, where he is again driving and driving and driving, thinking about driving west when it's getting really, really easy as a kind of allegory of American history. And at that moment, a pheasant bursts out of the side of the road behind him and splashes in a bloody scrawl of guts and feathers all over his windshield, which turns into another kind of allegory of American history. And he has this same moment of travel abstraction in the opening of his elegy for his father, Mortmain. I think these moments where you leave yourself and become all alone with the absolute are what are being described in his smile. Over Peoria, we lost the sun. The earth, by snow, like sputum smeared, slides westward. Those fields in last light gleam. Emerson, the essays on my lap lie. A finger of light in our pressurized gloom strikes down, like God, to poke the page. The page glows. There is no sin, not even error. That's a jeering remark at Emerson about Emerson's rejection of original sin. But I think what he's really talking about is that in this feeling of abstraction, you might believe such a thing. And Warren's irony is himself trying to grab onto something so that he isn't swept away by abstraction. I think of that moment that Wordsworth wrote about his moments of transcendent abstraction in the Ode on the Intimation of Immortality, where he describes himself trying to grab onto a branch of a tree so he isn't swept away into the absolute. That's Emerson's feeling as he's writing these lines. Night on the glass at my right shoulder hisses like sand from a sandblast, but the hiss is a sound that only a dog's ear could catch, or the human heart. My heart is as empty as an empty Coca-Cola bottle. It whistles with speed. It whines in the ammoniac blast caused by the passage of stars. For at 38,000 feet, Emerson is dead right. Well, what does that mean? At 38,000 feet, Emerson is dead right. I think when Warren is quoting that passage, he is alluding obliquely to a famous passage from Emerson's essay, Nature. The essay where he describes a moment of transcendent consciousness, a moment where Warren is looking down at a world, an ugly world with remnants of snow all of it, where the snow is smeared over it like sputum, that combination of mucus and saliva that smokers are always talking of. And Emerson, too, describes a sublime moment that happens in a very unsublime place, Cambridge Common in March, when everything is mud. And here's the passage, the famous passage from Emerson's essay, Nature. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight, under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. In the woods, too, a man casts off his years, as the snake casts off his slough. And at that period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel there is nothing that can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. And here's where Warren's quotation picks up. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. To be brothers, to be acquaintances, master or servant is then a trifle and a disturbance. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets or villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature. Now, I want to argue that this passage in Homage to Emerson is a parody of that passage in Emerson's essay, Nature. You'll notice it has the same, I fall away from myself, I behold the infinite, but I am nothing. I also am no longer attached to other people because I am all alone with the alone. It's also a moment which is powerful, but also slightly frightening. What happens if you don't come back there? You know, it's, what happens if you just don't get back from this cosmic LSD trip that he seems to be describing? And Emerson seems to be trying to shake himself, Warren seems to be trying to shake himself awake from his own trance, even though I want to point out he is fatally attracted to that trance at the same time. He both wants and doesn't want it. He wants to wake up from it, but he's afraid he might not. That's why I think the jeering at Emerson is his attempt to say, don't go there, Red. You're not supposed to be there. You're supposed to come back. You're supposed to be human. And I think he grasps on to the memory, you'll notice on the second page, when I was a boy, I had a wart on the right forefinger. That is to say, let me think of something concrete, something specific, something here and now, so that I'm not swept away into the absolute. I want to point out that that line actually wasn't there in the original publication of this poem in the New Yorker. So its moment as a hysterical improvisation is foregrounded in the version that it appears in the book. The poem is a sequence, something Warren invented in his earlier volume, Promises, a group of poems, Roman numeral, series of poems, that circle around a subject and look at it from different perspectives, but never quite bring it under control. Each suggests an aspect of that subject, but none of them have the whole of it. And each poem worries the question of the relationship of part and whole. At 38,000 feet, you'd better try to remember something specific if you want yourself to be something specific. So he has this odd memory of the black man telling him that the reason he has the wart on his right forefinger is that he's been masturbating too much. Now, what is the point of this memory? Well, the first thing is it ties Warren to his childhood, and it ties him to his childhood racism. He has the kind of relationship with this black person that Southern people of that generation would have had. But it also works the other way. This man can say things to him because he's subjected that he could say to nobody else. Because, as Warren points out, whenever he writes about race, you'll think about this in the Cass Mastern episode, the black man sees through him. You quit that jack off and that thing go away. And I said, quit what? And he giggled, he. And he said, you is got white skin and hair red as a termator, but you is humankind. Now you'll notice that is an anti-Emersonian reminder. You are human, limited, fallen, dark, not alone with the alone. But also, this attempt to root himself back in this world is a failure. At 38,000 feet, that is hard to remember. He goes on to have another very weird reverie. The spider has more eyes than I have money. I used to dream that God was a spider or vice versa. But it's easier to dream of a funnel and you, the clear liquid being poured down it forever. You do not know what is beyond the little end of that funnel. The liquid glimmers in darkness. You are happy. It pours easily without fume. All you have to do is not argue. So here we see how the moment of sublime opening is also a moment of surrender to oblivion, a moment of non-being, a moment of death. I also want to note in the line that is wickedly funny, I used to dream that God was a spider, or vice versa, that Warren is jeering at probably the most famous passage in all the King's Men, the famous passage about the spider, and I have to go back and share the screen to find that passage for you so you can see just how ugly Warren's self-punishing is. I think I need to do that by looking at the next page. There we are. Look at the bottom, at the end of the Cass Mastern episode. Cass Mastern lived for a few years, and in that time he learned the world is all of one piece. He learned that the world is like an enormous spider web, and if you touch it, however lightly at any point, the vibration ripples to the remotest perimeter, and the drowsy spider feels the tingle and is drowsy no more, but springs out to fling the gossamer coils about you who have touched the web, and then inject the black, numbing poison. It does not matter whether or not you were meant to brush the web of figs. Your happy foot or your gay wing may have brushed it ever so lightly. But what happens always happens. And there is the spider, bearded, black, and with great faceted eyes glittering like mirrors in the sun, or like God's eye on the fang dripping. I hope you'll notice that that is a version of this moment in Homage to Emerson, where you are confronted with a dark, sublime vision of transcendence into which you are absorbed and destroyed. A vision that is full of meaning, but a vision that is also full of death. And the hard part for Warren is how to embrace meaning without also embracing death. So I'm going to rush through a couple of more moments in this poem. I want you to notice the moment when he imagines himself drunk in New Orleans, picking up another drunk person. He sets him up, and then that person falls again, after quoting some vaguely Emersonian things. I think that what's going on there is that this is another memory that Warren is grabbing to try and keep himself in this world. And it's a memory of a situation Warren describes in a later poem, Folly on Royal Street Before the Raw Face of God. It's a memory of his life in his first marriage. It's a memory of those days in New Orleans where he drank too much, had too much sex, was too proud of himself. It's the world described in his poem, Old N Encountered on One Court Mule After Night in the Backcountry. I don't ever get that title right. But it's a poem in which, after flirting with a strange woman and a little bit drunk, Warren almost runs down a black junk dealer in the middle of the road. What Warren is trying to catch here is the world of his own first marriage, or I should say, the world of Jack Burton's marriage to Lois. I think we say the same thing in the multiplication table, which I think his vision of listening to the ocean on a pier in Coney Island is really a moment of the time when Warren was getting divorced. And the question he's asking in this poem is, am I still that person? Is that person capable of knowing? Am I Jack Burton in the middle of the novel, or am I Jack Burton at the end of the novel? And finally, I think, I'm just going to rush ahead, at the very end of this poem, when he has landed and he's home and his thought is, phew, I have not been destroyed by transcendence. When you reach home tonight, you will see that the envelope containing the policy of your flight insurance is waiting, unopened, on the table. All had been in order in case. So he survived, but only by luck, and only just barely, and he shouldn't take any comfort from having survived. But there is a moment of poetry waiting for him there. Does the wild rose know your secret as the summer silence breathes? So can I make poetry out of all these odds and ends of my very disorderly early life? And as he's thinking that, he has a memory. And I think I know what this memory is. It's a very opaque line. He asks himself, there is the city. The sky glows above it. There must be a way by which the process of living can become truth. Now you'll notice that's Jack Burton's question. And that's the question this poem is trying to answer. And I want to point out that the poem says there must be a way, but it never says I know that way and here it is. Let us move towards the city. Who's this we? I guess it's you and me, along with him, who face this same quality of our lives being unfended and mixed up and in various ways messed up. Let us move toward the city. Do you think you could tell me what constitutes the human bond? Do you ever think of a face half in shadow, tears as it would seem from that muted glitter in the eyes, but the lips do not tremble? Is it merely a delusion that they seem about to smile? I think this is the oddest moment in this poem because I'm absolutely certain that this is a vision of the face of Warren's first wife, whom at this point when he writes the poem, he's been long divorced from, and who he believes has spent the years since they got divorced in a mental hospital. Of course, what he didn't know when he wrote this poem is that she had actually left the hospital, quit drinking, remarried, and got a good job. I think he might have felt less anxious if he'd have known how that story turned out. But it's important for this poem that he doesn't know that. And I think the burden of this poem is, can I make sense of my life? Can I cling to my life? Can I find wholeness in my life? Can I use my life as a way to brace myself against the sublime storm of eternity? All these are big lessons in All the King's Men and big lessons in his conflict with Emerson. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can, there we go. Okay, so I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, John. That was amazing. That was exactly what we hoped Bristol Book Fest will always be like, that extraordinary range of references and connections and intertextuality, and one thing leading on to another. I will say that when I was a child, I was told that warts were caused by handling toads. So I'm good to have the real story, I guess, at last.
I think they're caused by a virus related to the herpes virus.
A couple of questions. One is that Warren was famously a champion of the new criticism, which said only the words on the page, no biography, no context, whatever. So you've given a very biographical reading to this poem. Is this a case of Warren saying, do as I say, not as I do, or what?
Well, one of the funny facts about Warren is that as a new critic, he never obeyed any of the new critic's rules. He never obeyed it as a critic either. His critic is full of history and it's full of illusions. It's full of all that stuff. I think the idea of the new critics as people who don't talk about context and history, that's actually a reduction of new criticism invented by the next generation's Oedipal quarrel with them. I don't think that's what the new critics did. I think they said you do have to pay attention to the poem. You can't reduce it to context. But I think they think it's perfectly kosher to talk about history and politics and biography and context, as long as you try not to do it reductively. The other thing I want to say is that Warren's own poems, beginning especially, there's a crisis in Warren's career. His early poems are very tidy, very ironic, a little bit cold, and very orderly. And then in 1943, after he writes The Ballad of Billy Potts, which is a poem in a completely different style, he hits a moment of silence, and he can't finish a poem for 10 years. He can't even finish a short poem for 10 years. If you go to the Beinecke Library, there's a little folder of 3 or 4 line fragments, but there's no completed poem there. And then suddenly in 1953, he breaks through and finishes his book-length poem, Brother to Dragons. And then in 1957, he writes a book of lyric poems called Promises that won the Pulitzer Prize. But one thing to notice about all of Warren's poetry after 1957 is that you really can't read them by new critical methods. They're too wild. They're too full of private illusions. They're too full of odd associative leaps. I mean, I wonder what people who read this poem for the first time could possibly have made of it. I didn't myself. I actually have to confess, I've read this poem, since I was in college, but I didn't really know even the first place to begin with it until I started working on this paper, when I noticed that the moment in the airplane is a parody of the transparent eyeball passage in Emerson. Up till that moment, this poem I had reduced to its snark about Emerson, but I realized that the snark about Emerson is actually the least of that poem. But the usefulness of Emerson is that it directs you to the kind of transcendence that he's afraid of in Emerson, and that he describes in the moment of flight abstraction in the opening of the poem, and in the episode about the spider.
You mentioned Nietzsche. At one point, Nietzsche wrote in a letter that Emerson would have been a great philosopher if he'd only had an education.
I think that's remarkably unfair. Emerson was an omnivorous reader, and he had a superb education. And it was, after all, Emerson who freed Nietzsche from Kant. Nietzsche was an enormous admirer of Emerson. And one of the things he admired about Emerson is his discontinuity, his transgressiveness, his tragic sense. We don't think of Emerson as having a tragic sense, but Nietzsche was a great admirer of the essay Fate. Nietzsche did not learn the lesson of the relationship between inwardness and democracy, which strikes me as that's really the central lesson of Emerson, the lesson that Emerson taught Whitman. But he learned a lot from Emerson. One of the ironies is that some of the lessons that Nietzsche learned from Emerson are things that Emerson himself thought he had learned from Kant. And interestingly, Emerson's German was extremely imperfect. And when he read Kant, he filled in the blanks and made up a Kant who didn't really exist, who was Emerson. So Emerson's originality was something that he wasn't completely aware of because he thought he was following in Kant's footsteps, even though in fact he was making it up.
So is Willie Stark an Übermensch, or at least one of Carlyle's great men who control?
Well, yeah. There's something I forgot to say in this lecture, and that is about the higher law idealism part. The higher law idealist character in this novel is Willie Stark. You think it's going to be Adam Stanton, right? Because he's sexually repressed, and he's a purist, and he's crazy. And he is a version of the higher law idealist. But really the far more powerful version is Willie Stark, who says, I am not going to allow all of those Burden's Landings guys with their high talk about how they serve duty and the public weal, and who in fact are a bunch of crooks who have been making life easy for themselves for 1,000,000 years and whose moral language is completely disingenuous self-congratulation. I'm not going to allow them to prevent me from responding to urgent human suffering. After all, that's the argument of higher law idealism, is that if you play by the rules, you are complicit with urgent human suffering, and they've got to be helped now. And that's who Willie thinks he is, the guy who's going to help the people now. And that's why he is both hero and villain.
Let me ask,
I think incidentally, that's also true of Huey, not just true of Willie.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Huey did some good things. And
I asked Warren what he thought of what he really thought of Huey. And I have to tell you a funny anecdote before I get to that. And that is when T. Harry Williams was writing his biography of Huey Long, everybody told him that all of Huey's friends told him that Huey was inarticulate in his first run for governor, where he was defeated. And Williams looked into it and looked into testimony about the actual speeches. That was totally false. All of these people who were Huey's friends and associates were remembering Willie Stark, not Huey Long. Now, I so enjoyed that anecdote that I forgot where I was going. So you asked me a question that I was supposed to answer.
Well, I was changing the subject. I wanted to ask you, as the literary executor for Warren,
Yeah.
why do you have another version of the book, the revised version?
All right. You've touched me in a very sore place. I think that was my worst mistake ever as literary executor, but in a way, I'm still glad I made it. When Noel Polk, who's really one of the great editors of the modern era, he's the guy who gave us all of our really good editions of Warren. For the 50th anniversary of All the King's Men, I approached Noel Polk and said, would you re-edit All the King's Men? And of course he said, great. And he went and got the typescript from the Beinecke Library. And being a scholarly editor, he thinks that his job is to kick the publisher's editor out of the book. That's what a scholarly editor's job is to do. Is the publisher's editor is somebody who waters down and bowdlerized the book, kick him out. And so he went back to the final typescript, and he noticed it was different in a bunch of ways, some of them better than the original version. Jack's relationship with Anne is much more fraught in the typescript than in the 1946 version. Jack's redemption at the end of the novel is much more questionable in the typescript than the 1946 version. Jack is much rawer and much more obscene in that version. Jack does not tell you a flat out lie, or excuse me, Jack is not quite so evasive about the fact that he knew all along that the scholarly attorney wasn't his dad. All those issues are handled differently in the typescript. And unfortunately, until the book was very far advanced, he was Willie Talos. And Talos is a character from Spencer's The Fairy Queen. He's the world's first robot. And because he's a robot, his idea about justice is mechanical in The Fairy Queen, and he's a total nightmare. He smashes everything he sees. So you can see why Warren wanted to name him Willie Talos, but I think you don't have to think very hard to realize it's a really bad idea. And I think Warren's publisher's editor was right to talk him out of that. But because I, editing the collected poems of Robert Penn Warren at the same time, believed the same editorial theory that Noel Polk did, I went along with Polk in doing that. And that fact alone caused every reviewer in the world to reject the restored edition of All the King's Men, and I've had to live it down ever since. But I don't regret doing it, because it certainly has been a great engine for people writing essays about All the King's Men. And one of the things a literary executor wants people to do is write essays about their author. So, so in one respect, it was a huge mistake, but I don't completely reject the mistake or regret the mistake.
Thank you for your candor. One final question. What do students make of this when you teach it today?
Well, everybody wants to, it used to be a part of everybody's education. In my generation, every 9th grader read All the King's Men, Julius Caesar, Animal Farm, and the Crucible. And you can see the agenda. All our teachers were people who had lived through World War II and lived through the McCarthy era, and by golly, it's not going to happen again. I think the current generation doesn't have those experiences seared into their consciousness, and this novel is not quite as urgent to them. They're not as completely on its wavelength. Though I think if you spend 2 weeks on it, they're going to get it and love it. Just because it's such a wonderful book, and the language is so wonderful, and the cast master in episode is so wonderful. They're going to find their way through it, but it isn't an immediate sell the way it was 40 years ago.
Thank you very much. Both our speakers will be back with us on Sunday afternoon for our general wrap-up discussion, and I think that's something we'll all look forward to very much. So thank you for what you've done today.
Thank you very much, Charles.
We're enormously grateful to get this program off to such a good start.
And a pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to be with you, Ernest. What a wonderful, wonderful experience.
So join us again tomorrow when we'll hear from a film historian, and you'll hear from me talking about the Civil War connections. And then again on Sunday when a person who's very hard to put into any kind of Emersonian pattern, but a wonderful raconteur, George Shipley, will be with us from Austin, Texas, to talk about politics.
I should say I am one of the very few defenders of the 2006 film. Also, everybody else hates that film, but I don't hate it.
I'd love to hear more about that later.
Okay.
So, for the moment, goodbye, and we'll see you on Sunday.
See you Sunday.
We had some other questions, but we'll save those for the roundup session.
Great, thank you.
Meanwhile, thank all of you who've tuned into this and been with us virtually, if not in the flesh. And I hope this is the only year we have to do it this way, but if we do have to do it again this way, I think we've learned how to do it. And I appreciate everyone whose patience and good humor and technical skill have gone into making that possible. So I'll wish you a good evening for the moment. Till tomorrow.